The first time my neighbor laughed in my face, I almost laughed right back, not because it was funny, but because I honestly couldn't believe someone could be that confident while standing on ground that didn't belong to him. He looked me dead in the eye, spread his arms toward the water, and said, "It's a lake, old man. Nobody owns the lake." 31 days later, I stood on my dock with a cup of black coffee while a federal crane tore his brand new boathouse apart piece by piece. And I remember thinking that sometimes justice doesn't make a lot of noise until it's finally time to get to work. My name's Raymond Ellis. I'm 66 years old, a retired bridge inspector, and I've lived on Pine Hollow Lake in northern Wisconsin for almost 30 years. My wife, Carol, and I bought our cedar cabin long before the expensive houses started replacing fishing cottages. Back then, everybody knew everybody. We'd wave from our docks, borrow ladders without asking, bring over casseroles after funerals, and argue about football instead of property lines. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. And after spending 3 decades crawling under steel bridges for the state, peace was worth more to me than a bigger house or a nicer boat. Carol passed away 5 years ago after a long fight with cancer, and ever since then that little cabin became more than a home. Every board on the porch held a memory. Every sunrise over the lake reminded me of mornings we'd sit together without saying much, just listening to loons echo across the water. I wasn't interested in making enemies. I wasn't interested in lawsuits. Truth be told, I wanted to grow old quietly enough that the biggest excitement each week was deciding whether the base were biting. Then the old Harrison place next door sold. For years it had been a modest cabin with peeling green paint and an aluminum fishing boat tied to a weathered dock. One spring morning, the bulldozers arrived before sunrise, and by lunchtime half the house was already gone. Within a week, there were dump trucks, excavators, concrete mixers, and enough construction workers to make it look like someone was building a resort instead of a family home. That's when I met Derek Lawson. He couldn't have been much older than 45, drove a shiny black pickup that somehow never seemed to collect dust, wore expensive sunglasses even when clouds covered the sky, and introduced himself with the kind of smile that felt rehearsed. "Hope you don't mind a little progress," he said while shaking my hand. "This neighborhood could use some updating." I smiled politely. "As long as progress stays on your side of the line, I don't mind a thing." He chuckled like I'd made a joke. Looking back, maybe that was the first warning I missed. Construction dragged on for months. The new house grew taller every week. All glass walls, stone columns, and balconies overlooking the lake. People slowed their boats just to stare at it. Contractors worked weekends. Floodlights lit the property long after sunset. None of that bothered me. It wasn't my money. It wasn't my business. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something strange while sitting on my dock cleaning fishing reels. A barge had floated out carrying long treated pilings. The crew wasn't placing them where the old dock had been. They were driving them farther toward my shoreline. At first, I figured I was seeing things. Perspective over water can fool anybody. So I grabbed the survey folder I'd kept since buying the property. Years working with engineers teaches you one habit that never leaves you: trust measurements, not assumptions. The old survey still showed every corner pin, every boundary angle, every recorded riparian line extending into the lake. The more I compared the drawing to what those workers were doing, the tighter my stomach felt. They weren't just pushing the dock farther into open water. They were drifting sideways, crossing into the water attached to my property. The next morning, I measured again using landmarks I'd trusted for decades. Same result. By Friday, they'd pushed nearly 12 feet beyond where they should have stopped. I walked over carrying my survey rolled under one arm. The foreman looked uncomfortable before I even spoke. "Your boss around?" I asked. He pointed toward the house without saying much. Derek stepped outside holding a phone against his shoulder, finished his conversation, then smiled like we were old friends. "Ray, what's going on?" I unrolled the survey across the tailgate of his truck and pointed at the boundary. "Your new boathouse is crossing into my riparian area. Your contractor probably doesn't realize it, but they're about 12 feet over." He barely looked at the map. "The lake's public." "The water is," I answered calmly. "The lake bed where your pilings are going isn't. Those rights are attached to the property." He pushed his sunglasses onto his head, glanced toward his workers, then back at me with a grin that still irritates me when I think about it. "You've been living out here too long, Ray. Nobody cares about invisible lines underwater." A couple of contractors laughed behind him. I kept my voice steady. "Invisible doesn't mean imaginary." Derek shrugged. "Then sue me." He turned his back before I could answer. clapped his hands, and yelled for the crew to keep driving pilings. The pounding started again before I even reached my yard. Every thud echoed across the lake like someone hammering directly into my patience. That evening, my daughter Emily called to check on me like she always did on Thursdays. I almost didn't mention what happened because I knew exactly what she'd say. "Dad, don't let him bully you." I stared out across the water while the sun disappeared behind the pines. "I'm not planning to fight him." She laughed softly. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm not angry," I told her after a long pause. "I'm just curious how someone can be so certain he's right without checking whether he actually is." After we hung up, I walked down to the dock one more time. Across the cove, music drifted from Derek's backyard while construction lights reflected off the water. The workers were celebrating another long day, completely unaware that they had already crossed a line far more dangerous than a property boundary. I went back inside, opened the old filing cabinet Carol used to call my paper museum, pulled out a camera, a notebook, and a stack of empty folders, then quietly said to the empty room, "All right, if that's how we're doing this, let's make sure every single fact is exactly where it belongs." The next morning, I wasn't thinking about revenge, and I sure wasn't thinking about lawyers. I was thinking about proof, because after 40 years working around engineers, surveyors, and inspectors, I'd learned one lesson that never failed me. People can argue with opinions all day long, but they usually run out of things to say when the facts start piling up. So before sunrise, I walked the shoreline with my camera, taking photographs from every angle I could stand on, making sure each image recorded the date, the time, and the GPS location. I photographed every piling, every machine, every truck parked along the edge of the water. Then I launched my little fishing boat and idled slowly around the construction site, careful to stay outside the marked work area while capturing the boathouse from the lake itself. Derek noticed me before long. He stepped onto the temporary dock, coffee mug in one hand, waving with the other, like we were neighbors sharing a pleasant morning. "Taking vacation pictures?" he yelled across the water. I smiled and waved back. "Something like that." He laughed loud enough for everyone on the crew to hear. "Make sure you get my good side." His workers laughed with him, and I simply eased the boat away. There wasn't any point arguing anymore. That conversation had already ended the day he told me to sue him. By lunchtime, I'd organized every photograph into folders on my computer, printed hard copies, and started comparing them to the original plat maps I picked up from the county recorder years before. I drove into town that afternoon anyway because I wanted fresh, certified copies. The woman behind the counter recognized me immediately. "Small counties are like that. Ray, haven't seen you in months. Everything okay?" I smiled. "Probably. I just need updated copies of the shoreline plat and the recorded riparian easements." She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. 20 minutes later, I walked out carrying a thick envelope that confirmed exactly what I'd remembered. The property lines hadn't changed in decades. Neither had the lake access rights. On my way home, I stopped for coffee, and while waiting in line, I ran into Harold Jenkins, another retired surveyor I'd worked with years earlier. He listened quietly while I explained the situation without mentioning Derek's name. Harold stirred cream into his coffee before saying something that made me stop and think. "You remember who regulates permanent structures on navigable waters?" I looked at him for a second. Then it clicked. "The Corps," he nodded. "Exactly. County lines decide ownership. Federal law decides what gets anchored into navigable lake beds." I thanked him, climbed back into my truck, and halfway home, I actually laughed out loud. Not because I knew I'd win, because I suddenly realized Derek had been so focused on proving me wrong that he probably never bothered checking who else might have a say in the matter. That evening, I pulled up publicly available permit records. Building permit, approved. Electrical permit, approved. Septic modifications, approved. Shoreline stabilization, approved. Then I searched for the one document I already suspected wasn't there. Section 10, authorization for work affecting a navigable waterway. Nothing. I searched again using a property address instead of the owner's name. Still nothing. The following morning, I called the regional office without mentioning anyone specifically. I simply described a hypothetical construction project extending permanent pilings into a navigable lake. The woman on the phone spoke with the calm confidence of someone who answered the same question every week. "Any permanent work below the ordinary high water mark generally requires federal review." "Even for a private boathouse?" I asked. "Especially if it's permanently anchored. And if someone built it first?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "Then enforcement becomes a different conversation." I thanked her and hung up. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even smiling anymore. At that point, the situation had stopped being a disagreement between neighbors. Derek had unknowingly stepped into a completely different arena. Over the next 3 weeks, construction moved unbelievably fast. Massive beams went up. The roof was framed. Electricians wired lighting under the eaves. Stonemasons finished decorative columns that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. Every evening, expensive wake boats pulled alongside, while Derek showed friends around the property like a proud museum curator. Once, as I was pulling in my fishing line, one of his guests shouted across the water, "Beautiful place you've got there." Before I could answer, Derek laughed and replied, "Wait until mine's finished. It'll be the nicest place on the whole lake." Maybe he believed that. Maybe he needed everyone else to believe it too. Around that time, my daughter Emily drove up for the weekend. We sat on my porch after dinner watching lights shimmer across the lake, while Derek hosted another gathering. Music echoed over the water. Laughter carried through the trees. "He's really leaning into this," Emily said quietly. "He's throwing a housewarming party before they're even done." I nodded. Confidence isn't always the same thing as certainty. She looked over at me. "Have you filed anything yet?" I shook my head. "Not until everything is finished." She frowned. "Why wait?" I watched workers unloading the last stack of cedar trim. Because if someone insists on making a mistake after they've been warned, I don't want anyone saying they never had the chance to stop. Emily didn't answer for a while. Finally, she smiled the way Carol used to whenever she caught me planning 3 steps ahead. "Mom would have known exactly what you're doing." That sentence stayed with me all night. Carol always used to say patience wasn't about waiting. It was about knowing what was worth waiting for. By early June, the boathouse looked like something from a luxury real estate magazine. Fresh cedar siding reflected the afternoon sun. New lifts hung over the water. Decorative lighting glowed beneath the roofline after dark. Derek even installed outdoor speakers so music floated across the cove every evening. Then came Saturday, the grand celebration. More than 30 vehicles filled his driveway. Boats lined the shoreline. Caterers unloaded trays of food while bartenders served champagne beneath white canopy tents. I watched most of it from my dock with a paperback novel resting unopened on my lap. At one point, Derek spotted me across the water, raised a champagne glass, and shouted loudly enough for half his guests to hear, "Still taking pictures, Ray?" A few people laughed. I simply lifted my coffee mug in return. Truthfully, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because everything he was celebrating rested on an assumption he'd never bothered verifying. Monday morning arrived unusually cool. Mist drifted across Pine Hollow Lake as though the water itself wanted to hide what was coming next. I spread every document across my dining room table. Certified surveys, county plats, dated photographs, GPS records, shoreline measurements, construction timelines, copies of public permit searches, and a short letter that fit on a single page. I didn't insult Derek. I didn't accuse him of being a bad neighbor. I simply described what had been built, where it had been built, and attached evidence supporting every statement. Then I placed everything into organized folders, sealed the envelope, and drove to the post office. The clerk weighed the package before asking, "Certified mail?" "Yes," I answered. "Return receipt requested." Watching her stamp the envelope felt strangely ordinary, like paying a utility bill or renewing fishing licenses. There wasn't any dramatic music. There wasn't any triumphant feeling. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done everything exactly the way it should be done. Before heading home, I made one final stop at the state environmental office to submit another report after noticing concrete washout residue drifting into the shallow reeds during construction. Different agency, different issue, same supporting photographs. By the time I parked back at the cabin that afternoon, every piece was finally in motion. And for the first time since Derek laughed in my face, I realized there was absolutely nothing left for me to do except wait for people whose job it was to decide whether the facts deserved an answer. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Every morning I carried my coffee down to the dock, watched the mist lift off Pine Hollow Lake, and reminded myself that once you hand something over to the people responsible for enforcing the rules, it moves on their schedule, not yours. About 3 weeks later, I heard an unfamiliar engine climbing Derek's driveway. It wasn't another contractor or another delivery truck. It was a white government pickup with federal markings on the door. I watched from my porch as 2 inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards and cameras. They spent nearly an hour measuring, taking photographs, comparing documents, and talking quietly with Derek, whose confident smile slowly disappeared until he finally started pointing toward my property with both hands. Later that afternoon, another vehicle arrived, this one from the State Environmental Agency. The following week, they were back again, and this time they walked the shoreline collecting water samples near the reeds where the concrete wash had settled. The lake felt strangely quiet after that. No music, no parties, no laughter drifting across the cove, just silence. A few days later, I was replacing a loose board on my dock when Derek marched across his lawn carrying a thick envelope so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "You happy now?" he snapped before he was even halfway across the yard. I set my hammer down and waited for him to stop. He shoved the paperwork toward me. "You went to the government instead of talking to me like a man." I looked at the first page without touching it. Bold letters across the top ordered all construction to cease immediately pending enforcement action. "We already talked," I answered calmly. "I brought you the survey." His face reddened. "This is insane. They're making me tear the whole thing down. They're asking you to correct what never should have been built." He took one frustrated step closer. "You could call them. Tell them we worked it out." I shook my head. "Did we?" For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The anger slowly drained out of him, replaced by something I hadn't seen before: fear. "Ray, come on. There has to be another way." I sighed because, despite everything, I honestly didn't enjoy seeing another man cornered by his own decisions. "There was another way," I said quietly. "It was the day I stood right here with the survey in my hands." He looked down at the envelope, then back toward his house, and without another word he turned around and walked home. 26 days after the order arrived, 2 enormous cranes rolled into the neighborhood before sunrise. Half the lake had gathered at a respectful distance. Nobody cheered, nobody celebrated. We simply watched as workers disconnected utilities, lifted roofing panels into the air, removed support beams one section at a time, and loaded truck after truck until the beautiful structure that had taken months to build disappeared piece by piece. What came next actually took longer than demolition itself. Crews extracted the pilings from the lakebed, hauled away broken concrete, restored the shoreline, replanted native vegetation, and reshaped the disturbed bottom under the supervision of environmental inspectors. One of the contractors I recognized from the original build walked past my dock, shook his head, and quietly said, "Would have been cheaper to move the dock 11 feet. I nodded. "A whole lot cheaper." Before everything was finished, word around the marina was that Derek's costs had climbed well into 6 figures between demolition, restoration, legal bills, engineering reports, and penalties. I never asked whether those numbers were accurate because, honestly, they stopped mattering. The money was never the lesson. Respect was, boundaries were, accountability was. That fall, a real estate sign appeared at the edge of Derek's driveway, and before the first snow covered the shoreline, the house had a new owner. A retired school principal and his wife moved in the following spring. On their second weekend there, they walked over carrying homemade blueberry pie. "Just wanted to introduce ourselves," the husband said with an easy smile. "We figured neighbors should probably know each other." I laughed and invited them onto the porch. We talked about fishing, Eagles, Wisconsin winters, and the best place to buy fresh sweet corn. Not once did we mention lawsuits, permits, or boathouses. Some stories don't need to be retold to the people who choose to start fresh. These days, when I sit on my dock at sunrise, the lake looks almost exactly the way it did before all of this happened. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about Carol and how she'd probably smile, squeeze my hand, and remind me that doing the right thing rarely feels dramatic while you're doing it. It just feels necessary. Looking back, I never beat Derek. His own arrogance did that long before any inspector knocked on his door. I simply refused to let impatience push me into making emotional decisions when careful documentation and the law could speak far louder than I ever could. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been standing where I stood that day, after your neighbor laughed in your face and told you to sue him, would you have confronted him again, or would you have quietly gathered the evidence and let the system handle the rest? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share with someone who's ever dealt with a neighbor who believed the rules only applied to everyone else.